What's up guys, Nathan here, back again with another Magic the Gathering set review. This time we're taking a look at all of the best commander cards in red from the upcoming set Aetherdrift, which releases on February 24th, 2025. My name is Nathan, you're watching the Solid Productions YouTube channel. Before we get into the video, just like to ask, if you like this sort of content, leave a like on the video, I always appreciate it, and subscribe to see more awesome content from me. And if you want to access some cool channel perks, check out my Patreon linked down in the description below. And I've also made my other set review videos for all of the different mono colors, and we will be recording the colorless and multicolored videos last. But if you want to see the rest of the Aetherdrift set coverage, you can check out my other set review videos linked down below as well. With that out of the way, let's hop right into the set review, starting us off here with Kickoff Celebrations. This is a 2-mana enchantment with Start Your Engines. If you have no speed, it starts at 1, and it increases once on each of your turns when an opponent loses life. Max speed is 4. Whenever this enchantment enters, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards, and max speed, we can sack the enchantment to have creatures and vehicles we control gain haste until end of turn. Now, to my eyes, this looks like pretty much a carbon copy of Bitter Reunion. Similar effect here. For 2 mana, we can discard a card and draw 2 cards, and then give our creatures haste later. Invasion of Mercadia, not as popular as Bitter Reunion, but still has a similar effect on the back side. I think that Kickoff Celebrations is just another great copy of Bitter Reunion. If you already play Bitter Reunion, you probably want Kickoff Celebrations in your deck. The Start Your Engines component is slow in the commander format, but if you're in red, you are probably dealing damage pretty consistently to each of your opponents. So I look at this as being a late game haste enabler, probably by about turn 6 or turn 7, if we assume that it's going to take us 3 turns to get to speed 4. So I think you at least will be able to access this in the mid to late game. And even with max speed shenanigans, we can only get there in 3 turns. But if you already play Bitter Reunion, you probably want to kick off Celebrations. So this would go into your standard reanimator decks that utilize red. Crocs and Kunoros want you to be reanimating creatures out of your graveyard, making use of that targeted discard in order to draw 2 cards. And then even if you are in any sort of aggro deck, such as Ishin, for example, you definitely want to be able to give your creatures haste for free so that you don't have to spend mana the turn that you want to actually swing with your Alpha Strike, maybe into an extra combat spell perhaps. So I think aggro decks could make use of this as well. And I think that if I'm being honest, Bitter Reunion will be more consistent, but you are paying the extra 1 mana for that guaranteed effect, whereas Kickoff Celebrations will not always be activatable on demand. So I think that this will come in second still behind Bitter Reunion, but Bitter Reunion is still a good card nonetheless, and I think this will join the ranks of these types of effects for enchantments at 2 mana. Next up here, we have Push the Limit, 7-mana sorcery. Return all mount and vehicle cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, sack them at the beginning of the next end step, and vehicles you control become artifact creatures until end of turn. Creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So an interesting little combat spell here. At 7 mana, we can animate all of our vehicles, but we do sack them at the beginning of the next end step. So that is a downside if you are not playing out of your graveyard, but if you are playing out of your graveyard and you want your vehicles in your graveyard to cast cheap reanimation spells on them later, then that could actually be an upside. It just sort of depends on what your deck build is. I will say that Push the Limit is competing with mass reanimation spells at the 6 and 7 mana slot already. Wake the Past does the same thing and gives the artifacts haste, but it does not automatically make them into artifact creatures. And we need to also be in white for Open the Vaults, which is 6 mana, reanimate all your artifacts and enchantments. So Push the Limit, first effect we've seen for vehicles where they will automatically become crewed or saddled when you slam this card on the field, and I think this makes for a decent top end in your vehicle decks, but it will also depend on how much you're playing out of your graveyard. So Depala, for example, very popular vehicles commander, except that she does not really deal with your graveyard that much. Edward Kenway could also potentially make use of this spell, another vehicles commander that utilizes red. There is the new Culloden within Aetherdrift, but he automatically makes your vehicles crewed, so I don't think this card would be best synergized with Culloden because he's already doing that effect for you. Next up here, we have Full Throttle, 6-mana sorcery. After this main phase, there are 2 additional combat phases. At the beginning of each combat this turn, untap all creatures that attacked this turn. So this is the first time we've seen a straight 6-mana, just no strings attached, 2 extra combats. Before, we had to take a look at Morag, which assumes that you have lands in your hand to fuel its extra combats, and then Port Razor could specifically attack itself as long as it deals combat damage to a player. You would get that extra combat phase, so that's also conditional as well depending on the blockers that your opponents have. But Full Throttle, I think, will be a crazy top end finisher in big combat decks like Ishin, for example, and even if you are running a Voltron deck, Voltron commanders often want to be attacking twice because you can only make use of, double strike and doubling the power. So, we need to double that further by attacking multiple times. So I think Voltron decks could take a look at this as well, especially if you care about the fact that it's a sorcery. There are certain Voltron commanders that will care about instants and sorceries as well. Next up here, we have Daretti Rocketeer Engineer, 5 mana star 5. Its power is equal to the greatest mana value among artifacts you control. When Daretti enters or attacks, choose target artifact card in your graveyard. You may sack an artifact to return that card to the battlefield. So a really nice homage to the original Planeswalker Daretti's effect here, where it can -2 to basically do the exact same thing. These artifact strategies are very prevalent in red, and these are quite popular in like Osgir decks, for example, where you're going to be reanimating a portal to Phyrexia by sacking like a treasure token or something little dinky like that, or maybe reanimating a giant triplicate titan, also a great top-end finisher for these decks where you're playing out of your graveyards with artifacts. So I think Daretti could be a slam dunk in Osgir type of decks, but as a commander itself, this might be another great option, or maybe even an upgrade for the Daretti Scrap Savant decks that already exist today. And that takes us to Count on Luck, a red, a total of 3 mana enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So a weaker version of Phyrexian Arena, and we can finally say that Outpost Siege has been power crept out of the format somewhat, because if you are looking for a repeatable draw effect, I'd much rather run Count on Luck at 3 mana. That's a world of difference between 3 and 4. I will say though, Count on Luck, the triple red pips is a real cost to meet. I don't think you'd probably running this above 2 colors. I'd stick to maybe 2 colors or less in order to reliably cast this on turn 3. But I think if you're in red and you're running, more than 2 colors, you probably have better repeatable card draw options anyway. So I think this is more of a staple-y type of include for mono red decks. Torbrand, Thane of Redfill can definitely benefit from this. A lot of big damage dealing mono red type of decks run out of fuel very fast, and so Count on Luck is a welcome addition to keep the fuel burning within these mono red burn decks. And of course, if you care about the fact that this is an enchantment itself, it could potentially slot into a Wildseer, Scouring Ma, or other type of Gruul Enchantress type of deck. Next up here, we have Howlsquad Heavy, 3 mana 2/3 Goblin Mercenary with Start Your Engines. Other goblins you control have haste, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 goblin that attacks this turn if able, and at max speed, we can tap it to add red for each goblin you control. My god, there is so much text on this 1 3-mana goblin. You can tell that there's already a ton of competition for the 3-mana slot in goblin decks, and Howlsquad Heavy does make a compelling case to butt out maybe another goblin that is in your deck, because my gosh, not only does this enable haste and makes tokens, but we can tap for a buttload of mana later. I mean, before we've only had mana dorks at the 2 or 3 CMC slot that are very basic and uninspiring, really. Iron Mirror, just your standard 2 mana dork, and then Slow Bad, you have to be in an artifact strategy in order to generate a bunch of mana there. But I think Howlsquad Heavy definitely will be powering a lot of late games in your, obviously, Krenko type of decks. I'm kind of tired of recommending Krenko at this point in time, but we knew that Aetherdrift would have a lot of goblins in it, so we gotta continue to recommend the Krenko decks. But we also shake things up here by recommending this in a Muxus deck, where we're going to want to be putting a lot of goblins onto the battlefield with his trigger. All right, and that will bring us to our honorable mentions for the rest of our red set review here. So cards that just didn't quite make the cut. Spire Mechcycle is a 5 mana 5/4 vehicle with haste, and we can tap another untapped mount or vehicle you control to make this become an artifact creature, and then it gets a 1/1 counter for each mount or vehicle you control. Other than this vehicle, that's going to be a pretty high cost to meet. Vehicle decks tend to not go super wide, so that's going to be pretty difficult to meet. So I don't think this is quite as good as a Slicer Hired Muscle, but it's an okay-ish recommendation as a vehicle if you're in like a mono red vehicles deck. Then we have Chandra Spark Hunter, 4 mana 4 loyalty planeswalker. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose up to 1 target vehicle you control. Until end of turn, it becomes an artifact creature and gains haste, which is pretty nice. +2, you can sack an artifact or discard a card. If you do, draw a card. 0, create a 3/2 colorless vehicle artifact token with crew 1, or -7, you get an emblem with Whenever an artifact you control enters, it pings 3 damage to any target. So if this looks familiar, it's because we've already received an effect like this in white with Lacquer and Armory, although instead of getting Vigilance and +0/+1, Chandra does give the haste. There's also a 2-mana artifact that's a little bit cheaper, but you'd have to pay 2 to crew vehicle until end of turn. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but I'll have it up on screen here. And I think Chandra, honestly, a great card to include in your vehicle's deck. This is still in the honorable mentions just because it is a Planeswalker, and Planeswalkers do tend to easily get hated out of the game. So this is something you will want to be protecting. And I think that in a vehicles deck, because they naturally become artifacts again at the end of your turn, it's not going to leave a lot of blockers up for Chandra, and the tokens or pilots that you might be making, you're already going to be tapping them in order to crew your vehicles. So Chandra maybe takes the place of some of those pilots that can maybe stay untapped and block for Chandra. But I just think for 4 mana, this is a lot to ask for a Planeswalker that will pretty quickly get removed off of the battlefield. So I would be happy if this stayed around for maybe 3 turns, and it would be also nice if you're running more of the junky type of artifact strategy where you can sack maybe a treasure to draw a card. Discarding a card to draw a card is not bad if you're looking to have that discard and, you know, play out of your graveyard a little bit, but just being able to rummage on its face in a generic deck, not great as for Chandra's +2. So this card, pretty hard to evaluate, but I guess it just really depends on how many other blockers you have sitting around to protect this thing, because honestly, it will just get hated out of the game too quickly otherwise. Next up here, we have Hazoret Godseeker, 2 mana 5/3 with indestructible haste, and start your engines, and we can pay 1, tap it, target creature's power 2 loss, can't be blocked this turn, and Hazoret can't attack or block unless you have max speed. All of that text doesn't really matter. What you're going to be playing this card for is its power. So if you are in some sort of fling deck where you can make use of a 5 power body, that's what you're going to be playing Hazoret for. The rest of it is pretty secondary, and maybe you care about creatures getting in for unblockable that have power 2 or less. Next up here, we have Endrider Catalyzer, 2 mana 3/1 human warrior. Restart your engines, and at max speed, we can add 2 mana. So this is just a nice honorable mention for the mana dorks that are out there. Again, the best we've sort of seen to date is either Iron Mirror and now with Howlsquad Heavy, for example. You know, those are going to be producing a lot more mana, but with Endrider Catalyzer, it is going to be an okay-ish mana dork for the mid game. It won't bail you out of the early game, which is the problem, I think, with this ability, because that's really when you want to make the most use of your mana. So, you know, I wouldn't look at this as a mana dork really until turns 5 or 6, and you already probably have to be in a Start Your Engines deck where you have maybe a Start Your Engines trigger in the command zone. So I think that's where you'd probably most find Endrider Catalyzer, because otherwise it's too slow to add that mana. Next up here, we have Draconautics Engineer, 2 mana 2/2 Goblin Artificer with Exhaust. We can pay 1, other creatures you control gain haste until end of turn, and the creature gets a +1/+1 counter. And Exhaust, we can pay 4 to create a 4/4 dragon with flying. If you this looks familiar, it's because it looks almost identical to Goro Goro, which for some reason this is not a Goro Goro, and I have a feeling it might have been changed at the last minute or something. Maybe the artist fell through with the art that was supposed to be for this card, but Goro Goro, basically identical abilities. The problem with Draconautics Engineer is that you can only activate the Exhaust ability once, whereas I would much rather play a Goro Goro to give my creatures haste multiple times. Then we have Skycrash, 2 mana instant with Destroy Target Artifact and cycling for 1. This is similar to Shredded Sails, but this one you get a choice to destroy target artifact or deal 4 to a creature with flying, but it cycles for 2. So I would consider Skycrash honestly a slightly more power corrupt version of Shredded Sails, and if you care about instant sorceries being in your graveyard, that's even more synergy with the cycling ability. Alright, and then we get to Territorial Aetherkite, 6 mana 6/5 cat dragon with flying and haste. When this creature enters, you get 2 energy, then you pay 1 or more energy. When you do this, creature deals that much damage to each other creature. So this could be a one-sided board wipe if you're in an energy deck. I think you could honestly consider this for either a cat deck or a non-energy deck where you already don't have that energy built up. It does sort of resemble a Thundermaw Hellkite. This only deals 1 damage to each creature with flying your opponent's control, but they are tapped, so that comes with a little bit of extra built-in evasion for your existing board. But I do like how Territorial Aetherkite can wipe out a lot more creatures, and I think that this is potentially viable even in a non-energy deck. Being able to deal 2 damage to each other creature, I think will wipe out, maybe 30 to 40% of the board on average. So, it just depends on your meta. Again, if you run into a lot of token decks, then take a look at Territorial Aetherkite for a top-end big body that can have a little mini board wipe attached to it. And that will take us to our top 3 red cards from Aetherdrift and Aetherdrift Commander. And if we could get a drum roll, please, we have Count on Luck, Full Throttle, and Howlsquad Heavy. Count on Luck, I think, is going to be seen the most within the Commander format, just because it can go into any red deck that's either 1 color or perhaps 2 to meet that red pip requirement, or if you're in a treasure deck and can easily meet the mana cost restriction, then you might be seeing Count on Luck in those decks. Full Throttle, an unconditional double combat spell. This will be just a great finisher you're going to see a lot of in big attack decks and Voltron style of decks, and Howlsquad Heavy is going straight into all of the Goblin typal decks that utilize red. So that is the video, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it and learned about a couple of new cards. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like on it and subscribe to see more set reviews from me. And if you want to check out my other set review videos, those will be on screen now.